100,000 tons of steel afloat for 9 months at a time. Inside this floating city, 1 in every 5 sailors is now a woman. That would have been illegal just 3 decades ago. Today, women serve as combat aviators, engineers, and leaders, adapting to months of isolation as the ship itself surges with relentless activity. But what does it actually take for them to eat, sleep, and work here in an environment built for survival, but not comfort? This is where the real story begins. Until the early 1990s, federal law kept women off combatant ships. The rules were clear: carriers, destroyers, and submarines belonged to men. That changed in 1993 when Congress repealed the combat exclusion law, opening every deck, compartment, and flight line in the fleet to women for the first time since World War II. 1 year later, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower left port with 350 women among its crew, joining more than 4,600 men for a 6-month Mediterranean deployment. The Eisenhower's 1994 cruise was more than a symbolic gesture. It was the first large-scale test of mixed-gender life at sea, with women assigned across dozens of ratings: aviation, engineering, supply, medical, and more. Navy leadership called it a stress test for both the crew and the ship's systems. Every aspect of daily life, berthing, heads, watch rotations, even discipline, had to adapt on the fly. Women on the Eisenhower worked the flight deck, maintained nuclear reactors, and stood bridge watches. Some were among the first to qualify in roles once reserved for men. In the same era, the ban on women in combat aviation was lifted. By the mid-1990s, female pilots were flying F-14 Tomcats and FA-18 Hornets off carrier decks, launching into real-world missions. The sight of a woman in a flight suit, helmet under her arm, became part of the new normal. This legal breakthrough forced a rapid redesign of shipboard life. Spaces built for a single gender crew now had to support privacy, safety, and dignity for all. Early mixed gender crews faced skepticism and scrutiny from every direction. Navy statements from the time acknowledged the strain, but also the determination of those pioneering women to prove they belonged. Oral histories from that first Eisenhower cruise describe a ship learning, sometimes awkwardly, how to share close quarters and high-stress routines. Many women reported pressure to outperform, knowing that every mistake might be seen as proof they did not belong. Yet within a decade, women were not just present, but essential. They became reactor supervisors, combat systems officers, squadron leaders, and culinary chiefs. The pipeline to command opened slowly but steadily. In 2021, Captain Amy Barnschmidt, a Naval Academy graduate from the first class allowed to serve on combat ships, took command of the USS Abraham Lincoln, a nuclear-powered carrier with a crew of over 5,000. Her journey from helicopter pilot to executive officer to commanding officer traced the arc that began with the Eisenhower's historic cruise. The legal barrier was gone. The reality of women living and working at sea for months at a time had become part of the Navy's core identity. A U.S. aircraft carrier is a city at sea, built to house and sustain more than 5,000 people for months at a time. The Gerald R. Ford, the newest in the fleet, carries a ship's company of about 2,400 sailors, roughly 500 of them women. Add the air wing, and the total climbs to nearly 4,700, with women making up close to 1 in 5. Across the Navy, that ratio holds steady. About 20% of active duty sailors today are women. On board, the numbers mean that for every female sailor, there are 4 men. In some departments, the mix is even more lopsided. The ship itself weighs in at 100,000 tons and stretches longer than 3 football fields. It runs on nuclear power, generating enough electricity to light a small city. There are 11 carriers like this in the US fleet, each one expected to operate far from land, often for half a year or longer. Typical deployments last 6 to 9 months, but the time away from home does not stop when the ship docks. Pre-deployment workups, training cruises, and maintenance periods add weeks or months to the tally. Over a 4-year enlistment, it is common for a sailor, woman, or man to spend more than a full year at sea, sometimes in one stretch, sometimes broken up across multiple cruises. Isolation is built into the job. Once the ship leaves port, the world shrinks to steel passageways, berthing compartments, mess decks, and workspaces stacked atop one another. The horizon is often empty, days run together, measured by the rotation of watches and the brief windows when sailors can call home. For women, the sense of separation can be sharper. In a crew of thousands, it is not unusual to be the only woman in a shop, a work center, or a watch section. The numbers affect everything from friendships to mentorship to the practical realities of privacy and safety. The ship's scale demands constant motion. Every system, power, food, water, waste, flight operations, runs around the clock. Keeping the carrier supplied and the crew healthy requires a supply chain that stretches thousands of miles. Carriers carry enough food and fuel to last about 90 days. But for longer cruises, they rely on underway replenishment. Supply ships rendezvous at sea, transferring pallets of food, mail, and spare parts by cable or helicopter. The logistics are relentless, and any disruption ripples through every department. Endurance is more than physical. The psychological strain of living in close quarters away from family and friends shapes daily life. For women, the challenge is not just surviving the ocean, but navigating a small insular community where their presence is still a minority. The ability to adapt, to find routines, build support networks, and manage stress becomes as important as technical skill. On a carrier, the stakes are measured not only in missions flown or miles steamed, but in the quiet, persistent work of holding a floating city together, day after day, for months on end. Every day, the ship's galleys produce close to 18,000 meals, feeding a population larger than many small towns. The rhythm never stops. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, and midnight rations roll out on a strict schedule, with cooks working around the clock to keep pace with rotating watches and unpredictable flight operations. For women in culinary roles, the job means standing for hours in heat that can reach 100 degrees, lifting heavy trays, and managing industrial ovens that bake over 1,000 portions at once. On a Ford-class carrier, about 100 culinary specialists, men and women, prepare food in shifts, cycling between cooking, cleaning, and prepping the next meal. During peak times, a sailor gets a plate every 15 seconds. Storage spaces below decks hold enough staples, rice, pasta, and canned goods to last the crew 90 days without resupply. Fresh fruits and vegetables run out sooner, So underway, replenishments bring new pallets every week or so, hoisted from supply ships by crane or helicopter. When weather delays a delivery, menus shift to shelf-stable items and creative improvisation. Women work both sides of the line. Some serve as food service officers, others as junior cooks or bakers, and many as sailors grabbing a rushed meal between shifts. For those on night watches or late flight deck rotations, the only meal might be midrats, eaten in the mess deck's fluorescent glare, sometimes alone, sometimes in tight-knit groups. The relentless cycle of feeding the fleet is as much about morale as nutrition. Special meals, like a steel beach picnic or a surprise cake, break up the monotony and give the galley crew, including its women leaders, a rare chance to show creativity and lift spirits. A rack on a United States aircraft carrier is not a bed in any normal sense. It is a steel-framed bunk, stacked 3 high, barely wide enough for a sleeping bag and a few personal items. Each sailor gets a thin mattress, a curtain for privacy, and a small locker tucked beneath the rack. Just enough space to hold uniforms, sneakers, and a handful of keepsakes from home. For junior enlisted women, berthing means sharing a compartment with dozens of others, row after row of racks, pressed so close that knees bump against metal when getting dressed. The noise is constant. Ventilation fans, pipes, footsteps overhead, and the voices of shipmates coming and going at all hours. Sleep comes in short shifts, often broken by the clatter of boots or the sharp ring of a ship's announcement. Personal rituals become essential. Some women hang battery-powered lights or string up photos from home, building a small oasis behind the curtain. A favorite blanket, a journal, or a playlist on headphones can turn a narrow rack into a safe zone, a place to disconnect from the relentless pace outside. On the newest Ford-class carriers, berthing spaces are smaller, 40 sailors or fewer per compartment, with bathrooms nearby and better soundproofing. These changes mean more privacy, less noise, and a shorter walk to the shower, especially important after a night watch. Yet even with these upgrades, the sense of confinement never disappears. For months at sea, that 6-foot space is home, refuge, and sometimes the only place to exhale. Fresh water is one of the most precious resources on a carrier. The ship's desalination plants turn seawater into over 400,000 gallons of drinkable water every day. That supply is not just for drinking. It powers showers, sinks, laundry, and the endless cycles of cleaning that keep a floating city running. On older carriers, heads were often a long walk from berthing. The trip could mean winding through dim passageways at odd hours, especially after a late shift or a night watch. For junior sailors, that distance sometimes brought real privacy concerns and anxiety. The risk was not only about physical safety, it was about the feeling of exposure in a place where privacy was already scarce. Ford-class carriers now build heads directly into or next to berthing spaces, reducing the need to trek down long corridors. Each berthing has its own head, equipped with showers, toilets, and sinks. These heads use a gender-flexible design so spaces can be reassigned for men or women as the crew mix changes. There are no urinals, and fixtures are chosen for adaptability. Lighting is brighter and routes are shorter and more visible, especially for those returning from late watches. For women, these changes translate to a quieter, more private routine. The walk from rack to shower is just a few steps, not a journey across the ship. These practical updates, proximity, lighting, and flexibility are not just about comfort. They are a response to years of feedback from women who asked for safer, more dignified routines. For the late shift sailor, exhausted and sweaty from hours on the flight deck or in the engine spaces, being able to shower and change close to her rack is a small but essential piece of life at sea. On the flight deck, women in color-coded shirts move among the roar of jet engines and the blur of spinning propellers. Each color marks a different job: handling fuel, guiding aircraft, loading bombs, or running safety checks. The margin for error is razor thin. A missed signal or a moment's distraction can cost lives. Some of these sailors are in their early 20s, already supervising teams and making split-second calls as jets worth $70 million line up for launch. Their training is relentless. 2 years of nuclear school for those headed below decks, and months of technical qualification for those on the flight line. Nuclear-trained women stand watch in the bowels of the ship, monitoring reactor gauges and coolant flow, knowing a single mistake could cripple the carrier. Shifts run 12 hours or more, with rotations that land some sailors on watch. At 2 in the morning, eyes straining in the blue glow of control panels, or against the darkness of the flight deck. There are no weekends, no days off. Every qualification is earned under scrutiny, and for many women, the sense of being watched never fades. A missed step or a wrong answer can echo beyond the moment, feeding doubts about whether they belong. Interviews and oral histories repeat the same theme: you have to prove yourself twice. Not just to the chain of command, but to the peers beside you, in the spray, the heat, and the noise. The work is unforgiving, but it is also a test of technical skill, endurance, and credibility, one that women pass every day, often with little margin for error and even less room for rest. Safety is never an afterthought on a U.S. aircraft carrier, but for women at sea, it means more than hard hats and fire drills. Department of Defense surveys estimate that 6.8% of active duty women reported experiencing sexual assault in 2023, a rate that, while lower than previous years, remains deeply troubling in a community where trust and teamwork are critical. The response is both personal and institutional. Every carrier is equipped with the Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Program, SAPR, offering confidential hotlines and victim advocates on call around the clock. Reporting options are designed to give survivors control, whether they choose confidential reporting or to involve command. Leadership is under constant pressure to enforce a climate where every sailor, regardless of rank or gender, can move through the ship without fear. For women, the sense of vulnerability can be strongest in the quiet hours, on dim passageways between berthing and workspaces, or during long stretches, when the only connection to home is a letter or a fleeting email. That isolation has begun to change. In February 2023, the USS Gerald R. Ford became the first carrier to install Starlink-based Wi-Fi, giving sailors the ability to SMS, email, and even video call family from thousands of miles offshore. For many, this digital bridge is more than a morale boost. It is a lifeline, especially for mothers and caregivers who balance Navy service with family obligations back home. Reliable connectivity eases the strain of separation, and can help break the silence that sometimes surrounds trauma. These changes are not just about comfort or convenience. Each carrier costs between $12 and $13 billion to build and maintain, and the Navy's ability to keep them at sea rests on the safety, retention, and readiness of every sailor aboard. When women feel protected, supported, and connected, the entire floating city is stronger. The daily routines that keep them safe and in touch are not side stories. They are central to the power and endurance of the fleet. Right now, nearly 20% of the U.S. Navy's active duty force and of aircraft carrier crews are women. Their daily realities shape not just shipboard life, but the future of military readiness and national security. As the U.S. Navy works to retain talent in a changing world, how it supports these women will decide its strength at sea. The next chapter is still being written. Share your thoughts below.